And it is recording. Hello, everyone. My name is Squire Karps. I'm here to teach you about single sword. This class specifically is going to be kind of like a broad overview of beginner to intermediate single sword. There's really a lot to cover, but to be sure that you all know the basics of single sword, we will be going into the very, very, very bare bones basics of single sword. Really quickly, just so we know, the audience and you guys know, how to transition into these more intermediate single sword. Y'all picking up what I'm putting down? Yeah. So first off, I want to make a disclaimer about everyone who's in the meeting today. We already asked, this is going to be filmed for Untitled Academy. It's posted to, going to be posted to a YouTube channel. Everyone in here has already consented to have their image and their voices added to this YouTube channel. So very awesome. Thank you guys for that. The goal here is to provide additional information and teaching during this time. You know, we're all currently, well, most of us are under quarantine. So we're gonna provide more info for newer people. So if you see this video and you're watching this video right now and you think it could help or benefit a friend of yours or your group, please feel free to share it with them. We also host these courses bi-weekly at Sword at UCI, which is a Belagarth realm in Irvine, California. You can find that on Facebook. And yeah, it's free and we would love to have you out. That being said, let's get into it. So as far as like qualifications for why I would be teaching you, I personally have watched lots and lots of single sword YouTube videos, taken a lot of classes at various events. So this course is going to be a lot of blends from things that I've picked up and learned from personal experience, either on the field or from somebody else teaching me. I would like also to, I've been playing for about 7 years now. I've been fighting for 7 of those 7 years consistently. And I like to preface this by saying, and this is a very important philosophy to remember for everybody, there's not like a right way to do this stuff. There is a million and one ways that you can swing a sword, and honestly, it only really takes that one to actually hit and kill your opponent. So whatever that one is, and the one that you want it to be and works, is the right way. You know what I mean? So I don't want you to take everything I say with a grain of salt. However, I want you to understand that this is not the letter of the law. Instead, it is suggestion of how you can all adopt these philosophies or styles in practice in order to become a better fighter overall. This also leads me to my next point as far as introduction goes. A lot of this stuff, and this is a good one, information is not being created, it's being discovered. So a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be putting a name to are things that you've likely already done or experienced. You've probably thrown a shot, and I'm going to put a word or a name to a shot that you already have thrown a million times. But the reason why we do these things is because when we attach these names to these things, it's easy for us to, for our recollection to go, oh, that thing I'm trying to throw is shot A or shot B. Do you all understand? So yeah, if there's a concept that maybe you've heard explained by somebody else as something specific, no worries, call it however makes it easier for you, okay? Cool. So nextly, so personally, I like to, single sword is it can be very technical, or it could not be very technical at all, which kind of blends in with the million swings, you know? What we're going to be talking about is more technical ways that you can approach single sword. But I want to preface this by saying, whenever you introduce brand new shots into your repertoire, they all pretty much start at level 1. And what I mean by that is, even though that shot might be the best for that situation or circumstance, your level 5 shot might have a higher success rate than this new level 1 shot. Does that make sense to everybody? So when you go out into the field and and you use something that you learned from this class or any other class on YouTube, and you see, oh man, that didn't work the way it was supposed to, I want you to understand that you're likely throwing these shots with less practice than some other things that you've thrown. Now, that doesn't mean you should never throw these shots. It doesn't mean that you should stop throwing your other shots completely. What it does mean is that you should practice these shots and find the circumstance or situation that they're most appropriate in. I like to think of this as, if any of you have played like Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat, okay, so I don't know, is anybody here like super good at Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat? No? No, okay, so what do you do when you play? You probably button mash a little bit, right? So that's what a lot of us do when it comes to fighting, as we button mash. We use our intuition and maybe the things that we know from our memory in order to fight our opponent, and we button mash. And the problem with button mashing it is you don't always know what it is that you're throwing, and you don't have necessarily like a play-by-play or a playbook that you're going off of other than just how you feel. So what I want you to do is I want you to start thinking in the philosophy as I'm trying to throw shot A in circumstance B, and try to keep that in mind. And then again, the same thing I said about the level 1 shot thing is now since you're going to be starting to learn more about single sword and to understand more what you're doing while you're fighting single sword, I want you to think of it as while you're fighting, you're going to be opening up your menu. Does that make sense? So much like Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat or whatever, you got to open up your menu to figure out, oh wait, how do I throw that one spiral kick or reverse wrap or those are from the Street Fighter and Belgrade. There's no spiral kick in Belgrade, or I hope not. But that's what I want you to think of it in your mind is now I'm going to be opening up my menu while I'm fighting or right before the fight. And because of this, it means I'm going to be a little bit more careful and I'm not going to be button mashing as much. Now, because you're not going to be button mashing, the times that you're going to be opening up your menu will mean that you'll often have the disadvantage in fights and you might have slower results or less wins for a little while. Does that make sense? This is a beginner curve that happens, is oftentimes when you button mash or when you're a new fighter, you're unpredictable to other fighters. They can't read you as easily. And the same goes for, vets on new people. They'll often be like a really tight curve real quick. And then once they start picking up on moves and they start opening up that menu, you'll see a little bit of a dip. Does that make sense? Does that make sense to everybody? And it's a good dip because after you reach that dip, you'll start to really rise up when it comes to your success ratios. There are a lot of people who fight based on their intuition or their skill set in which they've amassed without creating a plan, and they're very successful. And again, that's been prefaced in the intro, is 1,000,001 swings, whatever you're most comfortable with. But I'm here to offer you kind of an alternative to that when we talk about like a play-by-play. So yeah, does anybody have any questions about my introduction to single sword? No? Does that make sense to everybody? Cool. Wonderful. My name is on the Zoom link. If any of you had any questions about that that are not here but are watching the video now, feel free to send me a private message on Facebook and I'll do any more additional explanation on the philosophy, or maybe you disagree with my philosophy. I'd love to hear it. So we're going to get into some basics really quick. Well, actually, before that, I'm going to go over a base of just the basic topics of what we're going to be talking about today. And then I want to ask the audience that we have here today if there's additional things that maybe they would really like to see or hear about during this meeting here today. And I will add it to the agenda at the end, and we'll go over it. Or if I find that it's more relevant to something that we already are discussing, we'll talk about it then. So the things that I have covering, everybody understand that? Yes? So the things that we're going to be covering I'm sorry, as a pause, anyone who's in the meeting today, if you guys want, because it's a small group size and I can spread my attention to either of you, if you guys want, just put your hand up. I'll be able to see your hand and I'll say your name. And if you have a question, feel free. If I'm completely neglecting you, find a pause in what I'm saying and then speak out, okay? Cool. So we're gonna be going over the basics very, very quickly, just to get a basic understanding. I'll use some keywords, and if you are unfamiliar with those words, send me a PM, or you guys feel free to ask me. But those will typically be words that you can search or you'll recognize from other videos or resources that you'll find in Belgrade. We're gonna go over, in the basics, we're gonna go over our stance. And what that means is our stance with our arms, as well as our stance with our feet, our posture. We'll go over the benefits and the negatives of doing a sword foot forward or a sword foot back. We'll also be talking about the angle in which you hold the sword and the benefits of holding it at which angles. We'll very briefly go over guard, but we'll cover that later in the video. Next, we'll talk about common, we'll talk about common target areas in which I think that most people will aim for, which will mean that you will, one, want to aim for those target areas, and two, those target areas will be aimed at you. So I want you to learn how to protect yourself and find easier ways to take advantage of those target areas while not throwing for things that are very high risk, low reward. You understand? Wonderful. Next, we'll start covering why you're in the single sword situation, what happened to get you there, and what are we working with in our single sword situation, because there's multiple situations in which you'll be in single sword, and we'll cover that. We'll talk about, and this is a very common one throughout a lot of fighting videos, we'll talk about the inside and the outside lanes, and the benefits of taking advantage of the opposite of what is thrown at you or what you have just thrown, similarly to baits or feints, but when it comes to single sword. This is kind of the larger topic of the video, and it'll be really beneficial, trust me. Well, after that, we'll cover hand matching, which I don't know if is a term that you guys are familiar with. I think we've talked about it a little bit. But hand matching is a very, very important part of single sword and a philosophy in which I've adopted heavily that I think will benefit all of you as well. We'll talk about something that I am a firm believer in is the rock, paper, and scissors in combat sports. And we'll talk about what that means and what the benefits are of throwing rock in a paper situation or scissors in a paper situation. After that, we'll talk about some terms and what they mean. The terms that I'm going to be using today are fragile and at a disadvantage. And we'll talk about those later in the class and how you fight in those circumstances of where you're fragile or you're at a disadvantage in single sword. That'll also be really beneficial for you flow fighters or even sword and board. It'll have a pretty big overlap. The very last thing I'll be talking about in my video today is, two things. We'll talk about setups and what that means and the benefits of setting up using your arms and your sword or your body and your feet or even your eyes. I'll teach you that if we have enough time. And lastly, I'll go over my 3 favorite shots and how to throw them in single sword, okay? Does anybody have anything that maybe I missed that you would like to hear about in single sword? Yes, Beetle.
Are you going to go over footwork during the stance part?
Yes, I'll go over footwork. Footwork is an incredibly important part of single sword. In fact, I'll write it down. I'll add it to, I'm going to go over kind of like a basic footwork when I talk about inside, outside, and stuff. But I'll add that down and cover that a little bit more for sure.
Cool.
I often see footwork as being kind of like an advanced part of single sword. It doesn't have to be, but you should have some basic understanding of it. It will definitely propel you as a fighter. But we can go over that in more depth and detail for sure. And even exercises in which we can practice our footwork at home, because that's something we can certainly do right now as well. Yeah. Anything else, Beetle? Wisp, is there anything additionally that you would like to hear about today?
Maybe closing the distance with ranged weapons or closing the distance with longer weapons, because a lot of times when you're trying to block longer weapons, you end up getting injured. And if you want to dodge, you have to maintain distance, but that puts longer weapons at an advantage. So that's always something that I've kind of struggled with sometimes.
Yeah, I'm going to preface this. It's going to be, I'm going to describe it as single sword versus exotics, because that is a super important scenario. And it's typically really, really low reward, high risk when you try to square off against a red or a bow. But I'll briefly cover ways that you can get the advantage in those situations for sure. Okay? Wonderful. So let's get started. Let's talk about the basics of single sword fighting. And I'm going to go over a stance. I hope that you guys can see me in the video, but I'm going to change things up to, no, that didn't work. Well, so let's go over stance. So when we talk about stance, can you guys hear me from this distance? Yes? So when we talk about stance, we're talking about a couple different things. In general, we're talking about how we position our body when we're ready to fight our opponent or during the fight. It's important to maintain a positive stance. In fact, you guys have really good full body here. I'm going to maybe switch the camera angle. That's a little bit better. So when we talk about stance, what we want to do is we want to position our arms and our legs and our body in a way that's more beneficial when we're fighting our opponent. A way in which I do this is I try to find a center. It's a very easy thing to do is kind of use your body to find a position in which you're not going to be easily rocked about. And the way I find my center is I just do a little bit of a couple of jumps, try to find shoulder width for my feet. Hopefully I can do this. To find like a shoulder width. When it comes to proper sword stance with your feet, what you want to do is you want to take your sword and you want to point your toe towards your opponent. Very, very important is to keep your toe pointed towards your opponent. There's a really neat way to display this. I can't do it here. But if your toe is pointed towards your opponent, you can hit them at range. Imagine I'm hitting you at range. But if I pointed my toe away, I would no longer be able to hit my target. It gives you more range, which is very, very important when we talk about single sword. Toe pointed towards your opponent. And once your toe is pointed towards the opponent, you want to take your sword and place it behind your foot at a 90-degree angle. So you'll have a 90-degree angle with your toe and your foot towards your opponent and your sword perpendicular at this point with the back of your foot. Now, when you've reached this, and I really hope it's easier to, it's kind of hard to see in this situation, but yeah, so it's perpendicular to my foot here at a 90-degree angle. And a really good stance will keep my back foot at roughly a 45-degree angle, just a few inches behind that sword. Does that make sense? So when you reach this position, now, like I said before, try to find your center. Find a position where you're not, this shouldn't be off balance for you. This should be one of the more beneficial situations that you're in. Try to avoid like a fencing stance, because in single sword, what you want to do is you also, sometimes you want to be able to use the rest of your body as a target for them to swing at, and a way for you to defend yourself with it. Similar to like a sword and board, if any of you guys have taken a sword and board course. Once you're in this position, you can now take your sword and put it in your front hand. Your sword hand is going to be, well, the one you hold your sword in. And if you are riding in this situation, your toe and how your foot was positioned should match your sword. So this is a sword foot forward. Does that make sense for everybody? Can I see everybody's feet? Is there any way that somebody can give me an example so I can potentially correct you? Yeah, that's really good. Wisp, real solid, dude. And yeah, Chug, real solid. I like that a lot. You guys both did a really good job, and those are great examples for if you guys at home need something to compare it to. Okay, so now, good, thank you. So now when you're in this position, you're at sword foot forward. Your sword at this point should be at an angle in which is like this. There's a reason why we have our sword like this and not like this. You want your sword at an angle pointed slightly towards your opponent, but closer, pointed towards like your other arm. If you were to put your arm out, you might be able to touch the tip of your sword. And that's kind of the angle you want to be in. The higher you put your sword at this angle, the easier it is to get the inside of your body because there's no sword occupying that area. And the further inwards you put it this way, the more your upper part of your body is going to be exposed. This is a good sword stance to be at. Now, this can be applied for any of you who are left-handed, and later in the class when we're hand matching, identically on your left side of your body. So the same thing, left foot pointed forward, left hand pointed forward at your sword at an angle. This will be it'll be the same thing as a lefty for those of you who are lefty. Also, congratulations for being left-handed. So that's basic stance. We talked about shoulder width, foot forward versus back. the angle of the blade. Yeah, this angle of the blade. This is not, and we'll cover it later, but this is not the law for keeping your sword at this angle. There's plenty of different reasons why you would want to put your sword in different positions. Those will include baiting, or it'll include opportunities to close off lanes, and we'll talk about lanes later. Cool, so those are the basics as far as stance goes. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to be talking about common target areas for single sword. Before we get into that, how about you guys? Is there any part when you're fighting single sword that you feel gets hit more often, or something that you aim for more often on your opponent? Inside, okay, that's an interesting one. That's shield side, body, interesting one. What about you, Wist? Is there one that maybe you get hit more often, or you see that you swing at other people?
Front leg gets taken out a lot. Sorry, I couldn't hear you for a bit. The train was passing.
That's a great one. So yeah, let's talk about that. So as a general rule, what we're going to be wanting to aim for on single sword, our safest bets, are the parts of their body that are closest to us. That's a general rule of thumb. The less exposed you have to be in order to fight your opponent, the more successful you're going to be. These are what we call safe shots. And the safer you can throw a shot, it's not always the best, but it means they often end up being free shots. And I want to define that term. When I say free shot, what I mean is I'm throwing this shot without any consequence. These shots are typically incredibly safe. When they're safe shots and free shots, they're incredibly safe. These are shots like your mid-cross or a swing at the leg when someone's backing away or something. There's low cost. It means that you're at a very, very low risk, maybe no risk at all. Maybe there's no chance your opponent's going to swing at you. This happens often when your opponent is trying to evade away from you, or if your opponent steps in and you are evading at that same time, or you have gotten them in a position where they're unaware and you can just throw something real easy. Oftentimes, the shots that are the most free and available to us are the ones that are closest to us. So those target areas are going to be your opponent's forearm when they are holding a sword. I have a Bob here. I don't have someone to help me out here. But if I was Bob and I was holding my sword right here, I'm Bob. This part of my arm or this part of my arm are likely the most common target areas for my opponent to swing at. Does everybody make sense? Does that make sense for everybody? Now, when I reference the top of the arm, I'm also mentioning the bottom of the arm. There are ways to get to that, but I want to communicate that those are common target areas for your opponent. The next most common target area that you're going to find that's closest to you is your sword side leg, like Wist mentioned. If your sword side leg is closer to your opponent, it gives you added range benefits. However, it means that it's closer to your opponent, and therefore easier for them to take from you. So that doesn't mean 100% of your shots have to go for those target areas. But as far as our cost and our reward goes, that those target areas are going to be the most likely success for you or your opponent. They'll typically be the first ones taken. But there are other ones. Sword side shoulder will tend to be exposed whenever somebody tries to swing low at you. This is a free shot. I wouldn't say completely free, honestly, but this is a common target area in which your opponent is going to throw at you. In either arm, sword side shoulder. Here, the high cross typically gets thrown, which means that this is going to be a very common target area right here. This is one that I would say you should avoid. It's not very safe to be the person who throws the high cross in a single sword scenario, but you'll find that it happens a lot. And their body or their upper arm is going to be a good target area for you to throw it because, again, it's one of the closest things in front of you, right? The same goes for your opponent's arm or off leg if you've gotten them in a position where their arm is away from them. Those are going to be real quick, easy target areas. Does anybody have any questions about common target areas? No? Wonderful. So we're going to talk now, which is this is super important. So why are you in a single sword position? The more common situation that you're single sword, well, there's two. One, you lost your other arm. If you lost your other arm, you're in a position where you're single sword, but you don't have your other arm to be able to work with. You're now fragile. And I'll define that term now even because we're gonna talk about it. What it means when you're fragile, it means that any one hit on your body or your arms or your legs is gonna kill you. And that's often a scenario that you're going to be when you're fighting in single sword. If you're in a single sword situation, you probably got your other arm cut off. And what's likely the situation is that you were right-handed previously, or whatever your main hand was the thing that was removed. Another scenario could be that your shield was broken, or you were in a Florentine position and you were off, or you were Florentine and your off arm was taken. The other scenario in which you would be single sword is if you were fighting in a tournament that was single sword specifically. Now, there's a very big difference between fighting in a situation where you are fragile, which is one of the more common situations, and when you are in a tournament situation where you have the advantage of being able to use your other arm. And we're going to go over the benefits or what you have to look out for in both situations. If you are in a position where you are fragile, you are inclined to fight more safely than otherwise. That's pretty self-explanatory, right? And that means that if I say to you, yeah, you can use your arm to block when you throw a reverse wrap or something, that will certainly not apply in a situation where you don't have the arm to use. This is why I think is very important. This answer to that question of why I'm single sword is kind of going to be one of the big questions that you should ask yourself in the single sword situation when you go and fight your opponent. Why am I single sword? What do I have on me right now? Is my arm pierced? Is my arm slashed? Am I now using my off arm? These are all, or maybe I had this could even be maybe I had a red. And now that I'm limbed, I can't functionally use the red. I'm now in a single sword situation. I want you to ask yourself the question when you're in this situation that you're single sword, what are my assets? Why am I in this situation? What do I do now? Because that answer affects everything, really. And that's what we're going to get into, hand matching. And why hand matching is so incredibly important when it comes to this situation, the situation in which you're fragile. The likely situation for those of you who fight sword and board or Florentine, which is a vast majority of fighters in Bellegarde, is your primary arm is gone, and now you're lefty. Lefty single sword is, in my opinion, one of the most important things to practice in Bellegarde. Single sword in general is very important, but lefty single sword is, it's going to be, oh man, I hear a lot of people talk about like what their alternative weapon is, like what's their alt set. Maybe it's a red, maybe they like archery. Well, if you're a sword and boarder or if you're a Florentine fighter, really if you're any fighter, I would like for people to think of their alts as being left-handed single sword. You two fight with me at practice, right? When we fight single sword, or if I fight you guys single sword versus sword and board or something, which hand am I typically using? My left hand, right? Yeah, there's a reason for this. The reason for it is because when you're at practice, you got to level up your left hand. If you have a pellet home, like Bob over here, throw any shots that you can with your right hand, with your left hand. It's very helpful that you level these up. Because you got to think about it. Oh, single sword's important, but what's the most likely scenario you're going to be single sword in? Left-handed. So this is something I want you guys to put skill points in as much as possible, and we'll cover that. There's also a hidden benefit of using a left hand or a right hand, but we'll talk about left hand because it's more common. And this is called hand matching. Hand matching is a very simple process. In practice, you would be fighting a mirror match with your opponent. If your opponent is right-handed, you would fight left-handed. If your opponent's left-handed, you would fight right-handed. And what this does, and I don't have a dummy to help me out right here, not one with arms anyway, is if my opponent's right-handed and I'm right-handed, this simplifies our fights. We're both throwing the same shots, but in reverse. Does that make sense? So I don't have to worry about anything too fancy. I don't have to worry about a board when I'm fighting, hand matching. I just have to worry about this sword and my sword. Does that make sense? Our left parts of our body are kind of taken out of the equation in many ways, and it simplifies lanes. Oh man, I actually missed inside outside, which I'm actually going to cover now before I come over hand matching. But there's a trade-off, and you'll often see the trade-off in many things in life, but in sword fighting, there's no difference. If I swing outside, my opponent is going to more likely be able to take advantage of my inside. Does everyone make sense when I say if I swing outside? Like if their sword is right here and I'm trying to swing outside of their body, not inside of their body. This would be the inside of their body. And there's always a trade-off. If I swing outside and my opponent has a more likely situation than to swing inside. If I swing inside, my opponent's more likely situation is for them to swing outside. Does that make sense? Now this also happens high and low. If I throw high, my opponent has low, right? And if I swing low, my opponent has high, right? If I throw, and this is kind of a, just again, reiteration of the topic. If I throw right, my left side of my body is typically going to be exposed. Why is this so helpful to know? Because when we talk about risk and reward, the left high-low is going to be a big trade. You should be able to protect yourself or be aware that your opponent is most likely going to swing high if you swing low. And if you swing inside, where is your opponent going to typically swing? Outside, yeah. This can also apply to the other part of the body. So like an outside swing here could also be your reverse wrap on the outside, or king's wrap, or whatever you want to call it. But yeah, if it's outside, your opponent's likely going to swing back in the reverse in the inside. But what this means is you can set up in many ways. And we're going to cover that a little later. But that means if I am aware that my opponent is going to swing outside, I don't have to throw a full shots. If I throw outside, kind of like halfway, right, and I think my opponent's going to swing inside, I have the block here, and I could take advantage of it. Does that make sense? And this is kind of like baiting in a way. You're kind of one step ahead of your opponent. So if I swing outside and I'm ready to block inside, I can take advantage of their shots. So plenty of examples. If my opponent swung outside and I blocked outside, and then I expect my opponent is setting me up and I can tell he's setting me up to swing inside, I can feint inside and take advantage of outside. So this is a very much like a game of chess here. When we talk about inside, outside, up, down, right, high, low, are you the one throwing high because your opponent wants you to throw high and then take advantage of it? Or are you the one throwing high because you want your opponent to put himself in a position where you can swing low? Or maybe you're just countering them high, low. And this is a game that's going to take a lot of practice. But in order to simplify that, we hand match. So yeah, hand match would essentially simplify the lanes. If I throw outside on my opponent's sword, and he throws inside on my opponent's sword, it's very different than if he had a sword here, and I was swinging inside here, because my inside is going to be easily countered with like a high outside shot, which might not be as easy to see if you're not hand matching. There's also a benefit to hand matching when it comes to stabs and returning on stabs. If my opponent is sword foot forward, and I'm going to do this with Bob. No, Bob did the opposite way. Let's say, yeah. So Bob's sword side forward, which means this is his sword side. If we're facing each other like this, and it's kind of hard to see. If we're facing each other like this, my stab stops right on his body. You see that? How easy it is for me just to stab him? Well, that's the case for me too, because his sword side will stop on my body. Does that make sense? Now, if we were hand matching, and Bob was in a situation where his sword side was right here, and my sword side is right here, my stab is going to go right across his body here. Do you see what I mean? And the same thing with him. If he tried to stab me in this position, the stab doesn't have as much places to catch. Does that make sense? His stab's going to come in here. Better for the video. his stab's gonna come in here and glance off my body when I'm hand matching because my foot and my sword are faced towards my opponent. Does that make sense to everybody? This is a benefit. This also means you can take advantage of the situation where, like, if we're hand matching and Bob steps back, well, now Bob's in a situation where I'm going to stab him in the chest. You know what I mean? So being aware of how you and your opponent are facing each other will leave you an advantage or a disadvantage if you're paying attention. Yeah, so I'm gonna check the time really quick just to be aware of what time I've got. Wow, time flies, man, time flies. So we're gonna talk about rock, paper, scissors. Or does anybody have any questions on hand matching or the benefits of it here? If anybody else does, feel free to send me a PM. On the topic of hand matching, I recommend anything that you find on YouTube from Peter the Quick. Yeah, the videos are phenomenal. He could teach you anything you want to know about the topic of hand matching. I went over it briefly here today, but if you want to get more in the nitty-gritty details, YouTube, Peter the Quick Single Sword, fantastic course. And I'll send a link, or I'll shoot a link to this chat or on the page afterwards for what I'm referencing. Let's talk about rock, paper, scissors in combat. Now, this has been explained in a couple different fighting. Like, I actually heard this first on a boxing article that I read about the beggar, the liar, and the thief. And this is kind of like a rock, paper, scissors scenario. I'm not going to go too into the rock, paper, the beggar, liar, thief. We can talk about that in a more advanced one, or if we have time today. But basically that there are these rock, paper, scissors scenarios that exist in combat. I'm sure we're all familiar with rock, paper, scissors. Yeah? You want to do rock, paper, scissors really quick? Rock, paper, scissors, shoots. Nice. So let's think about that really quick. Beetle and I chose scissors. Wisp chose rock. Wow. Wisp could have beat both of us, right? But that's under the assumption that Wisp's rock is the same level as my and Beetle's scissors. Does that make sense? So the rock would typically have the advantage if they were on even playing fields. But in combat, we have a very, very different scope of what that means. Sure, rock will have the advantage in a lot of situations. However, if you as an individual have scissors and your scissors is just really, really well practiced, you know when to throw it, and you fought rock a lot with scissors, you'll know how to take advantage of the exploits and weaknesses of rock with your scissors. What this means from, like, as far as a philosophy standpoint here is just because rock beats scissors doesn't mean scissors could never beat rock. And that's a very important thing to remember when we talk about advantages and disadvantages in combat. Sure, a red can break a shield, but what I'm saying is you have to recognize the advantages of what you're using and understand the disadvantages of what they're using, and what your disadvantage could very quickly turn into level playing fields, or maybe you'll have the advantage just from your understanding and knowledge of it. Practice makes pudding. So if you really like throwing scissors and you throw it a lot, keep throwing it, you know, until you find a situation where their rock is better or higher. And along that point, I know this is like a metaphor and we're getting a little crazy into it. Let's talk about a scenario where rock, paper, scissors is a common occurrence. Hand matching. We just talked about hand matching. So hand matching would mean, in this situation, my left hand might be scissors, and Wisp is using his primary hand, which would be right hand. Let's say in this example, I don't know exactly, I don't remember. Just because I'm using hand matching doesn't mean that I'm automatically going to win the fight. Just because I'm using my left hand, and I'm simplifying the lanes on their right hand, they might have the advantage over me because they're better right-handed than I am left-handed. Now, there's two ways around that. You can get better with your left hand, or you can use your right hand. So again, not the letter of the law, just use the fact that you know that would be the more advantageous situation to your advantage. Does that make sense to everybody? Does that make sense to you? Yes. So not everything is as easy as rock, paper, scissors. And I actually have a course where I talk about it. Wisp, you took the course the other day about, it was my Verse Sword and Board course where I went over this in a little bit more detail about the rock, paper, scissors, right? We talked about advantages and disadvantages and understanding your opponent's disadvantages that they have and then taking advantage of it. But you need to be able to identify the disadvantages. And I'm getting on a little bit of a tangent when I come to this rock, paper, scissors, but it's very, very important to remember with single sword and hand matching. Just because you're going to hand match them doesn't mean you're going to win. But if you level up your left hand to the point where your left hand is the same level as their right hand, you're likely going to win that scenario. You then have the advantage. So practice your PEL. Left-handed practice is going to be super helpful for you. Any situation where you feel like maybe you should, or you have the opportunity, this fight's not that serious, or you can go to practice and just focus on you, go left hand. Go left hand with the disadvantage, go left hand fragile. And that'll help you a lot. You'll turn those level 1 shots into level 10, 20, whatever shots, and it'll really get you on a playing field in which you can fight left-handed and hand match your opponent more commonly. So I kind of, do you have any questions about that? Left-handedness, hand matching. When I say left-handedness, I mean opposite hand or mirroring their hand. So hand matching. Do you have any other questions about that?
No, it seems pretty straightforward. You just got to train enough to beat whatever they put forward on that side.
So Wisp actually is a special circumstance, and I talked to Wisp earlier before this class about how he is a Florentine fighter. Now, Florentine's a really important fighting style, and in many ways has lots of advantages. Florentine is a situation where you can hand match, and I encourage you to hand match against like a sword and shield, or even a single sword situation, where hand matching is likely going to give you added benefits to your Florentine. So these are certainly ways you can apply to your Florentine fight and have the benefit just by hand matching, simplifying lanes, and understanding the high-low or inside-outside switch when fighting Florentine is going to be really helpful. Same thing is if you're not very confident fighting left-handed single sword, practice fighting Florentine and try not to use your dominant hand as much. You'll feel a little bit more confident fighting single sword. This is not the same thing as fighting Florentine and just using your main hand and just holding your left hand. Not the same thing. Might give you a little bit more experience points. But if you're uncomfortable fighting left-handed against people, fight Florentine and try not to use your right hand as much. It would be a tip that I would offer you. But for you, Wisp, you can see how Florentine is very similar just to single sword, right? You see the similarities? Yeah, it's a very similar situation, especially when we're talking about hand matching. The next thing we're going to talk about is, well, we talked about it briefly about being fragile, which means that you can be killed in one swing. Will often mean because you're missing the arm, or if your arm has been pierced is a very similar situation of fragile. Not quite the same thing, but there's also the disadvantage. Now, this is, in my opinion, why single sword is so important. Is no one wants to fight in a disadvantageous position. And what I mean by that is, if you're single sword and your opponent is Florentine, you're in a disadvantageous position. If you're single sword and your opponent is sword and board, you're in a disadvantageous position. Your opponent has a whole other piece of equipment and a likely live arm that you won't have. This is not the end, my friend. Just because you're in a situation like that doesn't mean you're dead. In fact, it kind of really means the opposite if you know what you're doing. Yeah, if you're a single sword position, you have a more active bait available that your opponent's going to swing at. The less target area that you have protected, the more common it is for your opponent to swing at those target areas. So if you're in a single sword position and your opponent has the advantage, now you should utilize defense, active defense, and evasiveness or your evasion in order to get the upper hand in this scenario. What I mean by that is we'll apply actually the things that you guys talked about. You guys asked me earlier in the video is footwork or the disadvantageous situation. This also applies to if you're a single sword and you're fighting a red fighter, or if you're a single sword and you're fighting a pole. You have to utilize now evasion and active defense. what I mean by active defense is it's the opposite of passive defense. An example of passive defense would be I've got a real big shield and it's guarding my whole body. So passively, I'm defending my body. Or if I've got a big red sword and I can cover a lot of my body, that's a little less passive. But in a single sword example, the larger your sword is, typically the more defense you'll have in that situation. Not letter of the law, but a common occurrence. You want to now utilize active defense, which what I will apply as being able to openly bait things. And I'm going to give an example of one right now. If I'm actively defending you, I might have my guard in a position that is more fluid. Maybe I'll have it down lower on my body. So now all of this is available. If my opponent swings at me, I have more time to react and catch that. So let's say with you're going to swing for up here on my body. Wham! So now I was completely open here. But if I know I'm open here and I can see from a further distance that Wisp is going to swing at that area, now I can catch him in a defensive position and then I can return on something that he is weak at. So like, say his arm, right? His arm in that screen was available. If I hit that arm, now am I in the disadvantageous position? No, right? Now we're on even playing fields and we can reapply some of the single sword tactics that we were utilizing earlier. So that should be your goal in a single sword scenario, is with a disadvantage, is to stay alive. Because if you're alive and you can swing more and you can win more often if you're alive, right? We all agree with that. And secondly, get your opponent on a level playing field as you. That can be done by taking advantage of some of the things we talked about earlier, by swinging for the things that are safer and closer to you, like sword arm or sword leg. And if you put them on an even playing field, you'll have, guess what, a more successful time killing them. Now, I recommend, and I'm going to repeat this, but I recommend fighting in the disadvantageous situation as often as practice allows you. If you have a buddy that maybe that you go even with, or maybe that you beat more commonly, ask him, so long as you're cool, they're cool with it, say, hey, can I fight you, me single sword, and you full kit? Whatever that is. If it's Florentine or sword and board, ask them to fight it. If they say no, if they think that's offended, if they're offended by it, don't. Ask somebody else. It shouldn't be inoffensive. Just, you can preface it by saying, hey, I want to practice being in a disadvantageous situation. And it really will be good practice for you. So as often as you possibly can, you'll find this happens naturally when you're on the field. You can just find yourself in disadvantageous positions and work your way around it. But yeah, practice it as much as possible. Let's talk about the various disadvantageous positions that you could be in. You can be in single sword versus sword and board, which is, I think, one of the most common situations that you're going to be in. You can be single sword versus Florentine, which is likely going to be a very common situation that you're going to be in. You can be single sword and missing an arm versus somebody who's single sword and not missing an arm, or single sword versus somebody who's got a sword and a shield but is missing their leg. That's also going to be kind of a disadvantageous situation for you, because they have a way to defend themselves and you won't. The one that you guys brought up earlier was these, and I'm avoiding it because it's really just an uphill battle. Single sword versus a pole arm. Single sword versus a pole arm is going to be one of the hardest situations that you're going to find yourself in, or single sword versus an arrow, because it can just shoot right through you. You can't really defend against the arrow. You can defend against the red. What's likely going to happen is we have two different types of reds that we're going to be fighting. We're going to be fighting people who are using reds under and over, overhand, whatever. And I've got two reds, so I'll show you what that means really quick. But I see it for both. So let's say this red was shorter and they were fighting me overhand here. This is kind of like real big single sword in a way. I like for you to think of it that way. They have their hands over. Their shots are going to be typically coming from above. Or you'll have somebody fighting with a pole, maybe a spear or a glaive. Bob don't need to be this way. And they'll be fighting underhand like this, like they're rowing a boat or something. You know what I mean? So that means a lot of these shots are going to come in towards your lower quadrants of your body, or to your belly, and you're just going to get stabbed real good. But But what that means is you need to identify that what's happening when you're fighting this pole. Is your pole going to be fighting you up on top of your body, or is it going to be fighting below? And once you can identify that, remember to identify that because it's going to be important. You can position your sword in a way that's going to give you the advantage. If you see more commonly that it's going to come high, you should keep a good posture, come high, and block high. We didn't cover house defense, which is in my notes, but I didn't cover it. But I'll go over briefly at the end. But when people are swinging high at you, your common defenses are going to be up here and here. These are really solid. I don't recommend punch blocking reds because your hands wear gloves. But if you are going to be fighting a red and it is coming above you, you want to get slightly under by dipping your knees. You can't really see me dip my knees. I'm sorry. Let's see. I'm going to get really under by dipping your knees a little bit, not dramatically. Keep a strong posture when you dip here. And then make sure that you're maintaining a strong angled defense that is a little higher, because this is where the targets are likely going to come. Then you'll want to close the distance on the red fighter by taking heavy steps, having solid guards, and then closing in on them when they're in a position, when you're close enough to them that they're not as much of a problem. That should be pretty self-explanatory. But when you're fighting somebody who's using a pole arm, a little harder, you'll want to dip your knees a little bit, and then you'll want to cover the pole arm in two different ways. You want to either use side-to-side guard. Mind you, you're still going to be dipping your knees. In this situation, maybe more, honestly. Get low, use a side-to-side guard like this, or if you're in a position where you're already past their spear, let's say the spear is here, right? You can push down, because now you're going to have a lot more control over it. Does that make sense? I wouldn't commonly say pushing down is going to be an advantageous situation in most situations, but versus pole, if you're past that threshold, you now have a lot of control over the pole. Does that make sense? You can push it away, push it back, ride it up, and then swing inside, outside. At that point, if you're close enough to the pole, get it. But that's going to be a really good block for when you rush the pole, is by getting low and getting on the inside of their spear. I wouldn't want to fight the spear and necessarily do this. Either ways, if you can get the spear or the red away from you and inside, you're going to have a better time. This happens more easily when you have a second sword or a shield. Yep. Do you have any other questions when it comes to fighting reds?
So what if they're striking too low for me to block? Like specifically?
Don't. You lift your legs. Yeah, so you lift your legs. I'm happy you said that. If they're at the point where they're already at the ground, you don't have to, your legs aren't necessarily an area that you want to protect really that bad. Because your legs can also fend for themselves. It's real hard. I'm going to have to. Anywhere past right here, about, and this is actually really far, honestly. If I were really, if we're talking about single sword, I would say anywhere past your belly button or your hip. You don't have to defend with your sword, but instead you can pull your legs back. So if someone were to swing at my leg, I can just pull it back in that situation. So if like, there was a red coming at me, I would hold my sword in a position where my leg needs to be protected. Like I can't lift my hip up off the ground, right? But I can lift my leg up off the ground. So anywhere that your leg is still exposed, use your sword to protect it. That's what I would say. Is when you go in, come in here, get this, and then move forward. Or you can come like this, put your leg offhand back. Does that make sense?
What if you're at close range and you have enough space to dodge?
If you're close range on a red like that, the red likely won't have the range in order to be able to swing at your legs like that, I think, in most situations. Or you'll typically be in a position where you can kill the red. If you're that close, and I don't think that you're going to be able to. I guess it's hard to say. Like, we're fighting a red. Are we fighting just like a min red? Or are we fighting a pole?
Let's say greatsword.
So like 55 inch or so?
Something like that. Or if they have really good footwork and they back up at the same time.
Where is my red? Oh, my desk?
Yep, exactly.
So this is a overhand. When we're talking about overhand, this is going to be commonly used overhand. So if they're casting down or something, they're going to be in a position where they're going to be evading. And at that point, there's less likely going to be a swing that's going to be happening. So what you're describing to me is a situation that's very unlikely. And if it does, their sword's not going to have the same level of power. So I would still follow the rule of occupy as much of this portion of their weapon as possible with your sword. Does that make sense? So if they're backing up or something, or they're swinging at your leg, and you have your sword here, you pretty much win. They're not going to be able to generate power enough to get you. Does that answer your question? I know it doesn't really answer your question, but in that scenario you're giving me, I think that that's the most likely cause to effect.
Just getting closer and block higher on the weapon.
Yeah. But block where the sword is and get as close as possible, and then swing shots. Let's talk about this from an outside perspective here. So you're in a situation where you have to fight the red and you're single sword. How did this happen? Are you in a team fight? And if you're in a team fight, maybe you shouldn't have to be as safe killing the red. Maybe that trade-off that just happened of you killing the redsman led your team to victory, you know? Maybe in this situation, you don't even want to fight the red fighter. It's smarter to evade the red fighter and wait till one of your teammates can also 2v1 them or something. If you're really in a situation where you have to win it safely against a polearm, your best bet is to occupy their weapon with your sword, get close, and then, another way that maybe can answer, and this question is maybe a little bit more specific of a scenario, but if we're talking about this specific scenario, when you engage on this red, you can step forward, which you should be stepping forward if you're engaging on your opponent, but step forward and away from your opponent. Or away from the sword, I should say. So like, let's say your opponent is here, they have the red, and it's on this side. I wish I had a buddy, I'm sorry. It's on this side. This is their red, and it's on. If I'm here, and I've gotten close enough to block off this red, I now don't have to come into this red anymore. I can now come outside of this red if I want to. Now what I'm doing is I'm furthering the distance that this red has to swing at me, and there's a golden mean here. There's certainly one where, like, I don't want to be so close to this red. This guy can push me off or something, or I can't get a shot in because he's so defended, so close up. But I also don't want to be so far away that this red gets their range back and is going to hit me. So that's just a trade-off that you're going to have to see play by play, or in that situation of how close or far away from this pole do I have to be to still be safe. But it's kind of like, I don't know, like an oxymoron in a little bit. Like, you have to play it a little risky in order to take advantage of a pole, you know, in a single sword scenario. In really a lot of scenarios here, unless you're like archering or you're using a spear yourself. Yeah, you're going to have to be a little risky and understand that the likely situation is that you're not always going to come on top of the pole versus single sword situation. Do you have any other questions about that? Give me 2 minutes. It's hot. So the single sword versus the arrow situation, I think that was something that was mentioned earlier. Single sword versus archery is a tough one because if, like, the arrow shoots you pretty much anywhere. You can't swing at it during Belagarth. With current Belagarth rules, you can't swing at arrows that are being shot at you, and they will go through your weapons. So if an arrow shoots in your vicinity, pretty much get away from it, right? That's the answer here, is get away from it. Now, there are techniques that you can use to let them loose the arrow. The further you are away from them, typically the harder it is for an archer to kill you. Or like if you're, at an angle in which they're not shooting. If they're shooting over here and you're over here, then it's going to hit you. So that means that you can take advantage of that by convincing the archer that you're going to be in a position that you're not going to be in. This is feinting with your body, which actually is something that we should cover here. But when you're running towards the archer, let's say this is the archer here, I can run this way towards an archer, and then when they shoot, turn a different direction. Or I've done it before, is just spin out of it. That's a more or less common situation that you're going to be in, is to be able to actually spin out of an arrow. But that's the general rule I'm going to go with for this answer, is get them to shoot when they're further away from you, but close enough to where you can run and kill them before they reload, or are, again, protected by somebody who could kill you. Does that make sense? Cool. You can also use your friends to do this. If it's a open field situation and you're in a single sword, you can sneak around your friends' bodies, not your dead friends' dead bodies, but like their live bodies, and get the archer to shoot at a shield, basically. Or kind of like peek in and out of safe positions to where you can get your archer to loose. And then if you want to, you can engage the archer. Does that answer your guys' question? I think it was Beetle, right? Was Beetle the one who brought up the questions about fighting exotics? Oh, no, that was Footwork. Wisp, you answered that question. Yeah, so put a personal spin on it. You fight Florentine, so you find yourself in this situation a lot, right? Yeah, so as a general thing, you could get a shield of some kind, like a back shield potentially, or like a very small hand shield to get yourself out of these situations. But as a general, if it's just what you have, single sword, just try to get convince them to shoot, and then take advantage. So let's talk about setups. Let's talk about setups. Setups are, oh man, it's like 80% of how I fight. Setting up means that you are making your opponent do something, and then you're going to take advantage of it. So by setting up your opponent, and you can do this in many different ways. You can give them false information and then let them treat that information as being truthful. That's very similar to like a feint or a bait. If I can convince my opponent that I'm throwing this way, my opponent will throw the most likely thing that will counter that, right? If they're smart. Kind of like the inside-outside thing we talked about earlier, is if I throw outside and I know they're going to swing inside, I can defend inside and then take advantage of outside. And you just kind of try to be one step ahead of your opponent. Setting up is kind of doing that. And you do that in many different ways. I do it mostly with either my hands, my feet, or my eyes. When you do it with your hands, it's just basically what I say by setting up is you're adding a combination of baits, feints, and things that you have thrown in the past in order to add to their combat computer, in order to get them think a different way, and then you take advantage of it. I'm going to show you an example of a couple very simple ways that I do that. Setting up is if you can get your opponent to be in a hand matching situation where their sword foot is forward and your sword foot is forward, their arm is now closer to you, right? Well, it should be. And now that's your easiest area. But if they're in a situation where their arm is that way, they know their arm is that way. So you want to feint them in a way to where they're going to actually, and this is one of my favorite ones actually. We have a fighter in our realm, I'm not going to name their names, but we hand match often. And they will often use their offhand in front of them like this, which isn't a bad say, it's just a way to do it. But if I can get them to take this leg and step back, now when they do it too much, they'll expose more of their arm. So you can do that by just throwing, like, you don't have to throw real shots at their leg. You can just throw like, hey, I can maybe hit that. And it'll get your opponent to go, hey, he can maybe hit that. So what do? They defend that by putting it away from them. And what you do is you say, well, that was the cause. What's the effect of this? And the effect of this in that situation is now their arm is closer to me on this side. So you can swing low, and then you're setting up your opponent for their arm is to be available there. So that's a very common one that I like, is to, if they're fighting shield foot forward, just swipe at it. You don't actually have to hit it, just swipe at it. Get them to step back and then take advantage of whatever is now available to you. This happens in many different ways. I'm going to show you guys my favorite single sword shot. And that is, I wish I had somebody to help me out here. I think it'd be really helpful here, but I'm working what I got. Throw a stab, not a real stab, but a fake stab. If they're in a hand matching situation, you can throw a fake stab over here and step towards it. And then when they'll move their sword further away from their body in order to protect themselves from the stab. I'm going to sword really quick to show you that. Their sword's here, my sword's here. If I stab this way, they'll push the stab out this way, and that means their arm, which is holding the sword, is now exposed. So a very easy way to throw that. The step looks like this. Step forward with your offhand, and then, or your off foot forward. Step here so you're very safe still, and then you throw outside of their arm. Your target that you're stabbing is not, it's like, I guess it could be their body. You could land the stab, but we're going for the your left, their right portion of their body in the hand matching situation here, and then exposing their arm. And I'll do that slower. I think the camera didn't capture. Stab here, expose the arm. Does that make sense? Because the arm went from being in this position, likely just a regular sword stance, and is now moved to protect themselves from the stab. And then you take advantage of the arm. Or their shoulder, likely the arm. The arm will typically give you the advantage, and then likely give you the win. Here. Do this at whatever range you feel comfortable at. So if it's here, it could be really close. You could come in here, you could actually grab the shoulder. You shouldn't do that in a single sword situation, but this shot can be applied to a full kit situation as well. Do you have any questions about that shot specifically? So it is a stab towards their center shield side body. Not intended to hit, but more of a feint. When they go to take advantage, or when they go to defend themselves by moving their sword, your shot will come in onto their sword side body. Here. Here. And if you're in a hand matching situation, the same thing applies. They're right-handed, you stab this way, and then take advantage. Okay. My next favorite single sword shot is going to be a super low success shot, which is really neat, actually. I like to show this one to you guys. The reason why I say it's super low success is because it's not intended to get the win. Like, you throw this shot, and the purpose of this shot is to get your opponent to take their sword arm and place it behind their shield, or to get them to get closer to their body. This is a very safe shot to throw. It is low battery. This is a very safe shot to throw. Oh, I got a note. Okay, cool. This shot will come as an uppercut thrown like this. You see this? This swoop happening here? This is the motion of my arm. So I'll come and I'll throw it like this. So that way the upper part of my sword here, if I were to like to swing straight up, this can be just a quick toss this way. Where I throw this to is a very specific spot. I'm throwing this at my opponent's forearm right here. See what I mean? Right here. The reason why I throw that here in a single sword situation is because it's very safe. is you can throw it from really far away. And even if you're likely not going to land, but what this does is it shows your opponent, hey, I have to look out for this. A lot of times people, they're like, oh, I don't have to look out for this. So they get real close and they get real forward and they want to throw at you, right? But if you throw them like this, and they got a lot of upward guard here. So if you're someone who likes to fight at somebody's shoulders, I like to fight shoulders. But if you're someone who likes to fight shoulders like me, you don't want your opponent to have their sword occupying their shoulders as often, right? So throwing a shot that's just a quick scoop or an undercut, or you could even technically throw a stab here. I like the undercut because there is a small margin of success for just sniping the arm. But if you throw under like that, what they'll do is if this happens, and even if they don't get hit, say it happens and hits their pommel or something, right? Now their sword, which would have been in this position, will come lower. Does that make sense? Because now they have to worry. Or if this is a sword and board situation, that arm will now go behind their shield. Does that make sense? This shot, the purpose of this can also be done by using like a reverse wrap or a flat wrap to their sword side. Although I like this one a little bit better. It's less common. You won't use it as often. But it'll typically dramatically change where your opponent's holding their sword. And that's why I like that shot. You kind of understand what I mean by that shot? Cool. Send me a PM if you guys don't understand what I mean by that shot. And I will share, does anybody have any questions? You can also occupy kind of a similar situation by just throwing the reverse wrap from further away. The reason why I don't like the reverse wrap from further away is I feel like it exposes the shoulder, and will actually get them sometimes to want to fight even further, which could be a bad thing, could be a good thing, but that's why I don't like that situation versus just throwing a really safe scoop. I'm further away when I throw the scoop, and I have less, that makes sense? Less time they're gonna actually take advantage of this. My last one I was going to mention with my 3 favorite shots for single sword is, oh yes, it's going to be similar to the stab and the take advantage, but this is a non-hand matched situation where your opponent is actually going to be right-handed or left-handed if you're left-handed, or you're right-handed. So let's say me and my opponent are both fighting right-handed. What I want to be doing is I want to be throwing, we talked about the get the F away from me shot. This is the mid-cross, center cross, throw it right here. What this shot does is it will get your opponent to either step back, or it'll get them to pull their sword back. And the reason why I think this is important as a combination, because this will often get them to do in a situation where they'll expose a part of their body. So a center cross or a mid cross combined with a chop of some kind is a really good setup. So here to here, here to here is a good one. Specifically, the situation that I'm looking for is throwing across and stepping. So if I step here, their sword will come out, but their body won't always come out. So if their sword comes out this way, while I chopped, this can now turn into an arm chop here. Does that make sense? You'll often find when you feint with your body that your opponent's kit will move before their body moves. This is a common theme that you can take advantage of when fighting single sword by feinting with your feet or with your body by moving their kit and not their body. Does that make sense? Oh, hey, for that shot, try putting your offhand forward, or your leg forward here. Now throw the center cross and step. No, switch back. So this hand, this foot forward, like this. There we go. No. Your sword is going to be your offhand now. So like, okay, so what if you're going lefty? Go lefty, right here. Go lefty. Okay, now just switch swords, but keep the stance. Yeah, there we go. Say it like this. So when you throw this is a really hard thing to do. But if you're going to be occupying this part of their body, you can just do a full step. Step here. Does that make sense? Here. What you're doing is you have a wall. Your single sword is like a wall here. And this wall is being cast. If you're on the left of your opponent's body, this wall is between you and your opponent. So now now if your opponent were to swing over on their side, you can catch these blocks easier and make your turns faster. So, yeah, those are my 3 favorite single sword shots. Yep. Does anybody have any questions about any more shots that they would like to practice with when it comes to single sword specific? No? Good. Is there any general questions for the class? Anything anybody else would like to learn about single sword before we cut out? I know one. I didn't talk about footwork. So kind of like a general thing. We talked about this in a Pell course that we had, but you want to move your feet whenever you're swinging your sword. Not every single time in practice, but when you're actually practicing or you're doing your Pell, you want to use your feet alongside your body. And that means if I throw a shot, maybe it's a shot to their outside here, I'm stepping in with it with my foot. I step there. And that's an important thing to remember when you throw is don't just stay static on your feet. Keep your heels off the ground as often as you can, really, and throw shots alongside your legs. As far as general footwork, things that are going to be successful for you as exercise is by doing ladders or by doing anything that you're going to be stepping more often and be more aware of your feet as you're moving. Jump rope is going to be good. Build strong muscles in your legs as well as going to keep you nimble. Try not to be flat-footed when you're sword fighting, especially single sword. Evasion is going to be one of your best friends, and being able to step back appropriately is going to help you a lot. You can practice this by really just by using your feet as often as possible when you fight. If you send yourself a little notification when you get a chance in your brain and go, oh, am I flat-footed? Am I moving my feet enough? And if you continue to ask yourself that during practice or during Pell work, remind yourself you'll stay off your feet a little bit more, okay? Footwork is important. Understanding, am I sword foot forward right now? Am I shield foot forward? This is really just going to come down to awareness. Yeah, just be aware as often as possible of your feet. Okay, cool. I'm very happy that all of you attended. We have more classes. This one, the single sword, was one of the more requested ones. If any of you are watching this video and you're like, hey, you know what, I've got a few more things I'd like to add to single sword, feel free to hit me with a PM on Facebook, and I'll get you a slot for our classes. If you have any specific questions that you would like to have answered about this topic in general that was not answered today, feel free to send me a PM or message Sword at UCI or any of the officers representatives there, and they'll be able to help you out. Look forward to more courses in either combat, arts, culture, and Belagarth, and we're happy to host you. All right. Thanks, everybody. Oh, thank all of you for attending. Wisp and Beetle, we didn't do introductions, but these are members of Sword at UCI as a practice in Irvine. And they're also current officers in our practice, so very happy to have them. See you guys later.